Karen was the kind of person who loved attention. Back home, in a small town in Ohio, she was known as the life of every party, always ready with a story, a joke, or some over-the-top stunt to make people laugh. But this time, Karen wasn't just trying to impress her neighbors. She was thousands of miles away in London, soaking up everything the city had to offer and determined to make her trip unforgettable. Her Instagram feed was already filled with pictures of Big Ben, red phone booths, and double-decker buses. Still, something was missing. A moment that would truly set her apart from the other tourists. On her third day in the city, Karen decided to visit Buckingham Palace. She'd heard so much about the famous changing of the guard ceremony and wanted to see it for herself. Clutching her oversized designer handbag and wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy weather, she joined the crowd outside the palace gates. The royal guard stood tall and still, their bright red uniforms and towering bearskin hats making them look almost larger than life. Tourists buzzed around them, snapping photos and giggling at their stoic expressions. Karen watched closely, fascinated but also confused. Why weren't they moving? Why didn't they smile or wave back when someone tried to get their attention? To her, it seemed like they were part of some elaborate performance meant to entertain visitors. And if they were putting on a show, why not join in? Her competitive streak kicked in. What if she could get one of these guards to react? That would be the perfect story to share with her friends back home. Maybe even go viral online. As the idea took root in her mind, Karen felt a spark of excitement. She stepped closer to one of the guards, whose nameplate read Corporal Harris. He stood perfectly still, his rifle resting by his side, staring straight ahead, as though nothing existed beyond his line of vision. At first, Karen tried simple things. She waved her hand in front of his face, expecting him to flinch or blink. Nothing. Then she leaned in close, puckering her lips into a fish face, while holding up her phone to record his reaction. Still nothing. Frustrated but undeterred, she started talking louder, hoping to provoke him. "Are you real?" she asked sarcastically, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Or are you just a statue pretending to be human?" Some people chuckled nervously, while others rolled their eyes. A few muttered disapproving comments under their breath. But Karen didn't care. She thrived on chaos, and right now, all eyes were on her. Encouraged by the attention, she dug deeper into her bag of tricks. That's when she found it. The pepper spray. It had been tucked away in her purse since her college days, a relic from a self-defense class she'd taken years ago. At the time, it felt like a fun keepsake. Now, it seemed like an opportunity. Karen hesitated for only a moment before deciding to take the prank further. If waving and making faces hadn't worked, maybe this would. After all, how could anyone stay completely still after being sprayed in the face? With a mischievous grin, she gave the canister a quick shake, aimed carefully, and prepared to press the button. Little did she know, this decision would change her trip and her life forever. Karen's heart raced as she held the small canister of pepper spray in her hand. The weight of it felt heavier than she'd expected, and for a brief second, doubt flickered across her mind. Was this really a good idea? But before she could second-guess herself, the thrill of the moment took over. She glanced around at the growing crowd of tourists, snapping photos and whispering among themselves. They were watching her now, waiting to see what she would do next. That was all the encouragement Karen needed. She stepped even closer to Corporal Harris, her heels clicking loudly against the cobblestone pavement. Up close, he seemed even taller and more imposing than she had realized. His face was expressionless, his posture rigid, and his gloved hands rested lightly on the rifle slung over his shoulder. To Karen, it almost felt like standing next to a statue instead of a real person. But that didn't stop her from trying one last time to get a reaction out of him. "Hey, buddy," she called out, deliberately raising her voice so everyone nearby could hear. "You're supposed to be guarding something important, right? Shouldn't you be paying attention?" When he didn't respond, not even a twitch or blink, Karen smirked. "Okay, fine. if you're not going to play along." With a dramatic flourish, she pulled the trigger on the pepper spray, releasing a quick burst directly toward Corporal Harris's face. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as people realized what had just happened. Some covered their mouths in shock, while others instinctively stepped back, unsure of how the situation would unfold. For a few tense seconds, there was complete silence. But then something unexpected happened, or rather, didn't happen. Corporal Harris blinked once, slowly, as if processing the sudden sting in his eyes. Then, without missing a beat, he raised a gloved hand to wipe away the irritation. His movements were calm and deliberate, betraying no hint of anger or frustration. He didn't shout, curse, or even move from his position. Instead, he simply resumed his original stance, staring straight ahead as though nothing unusual had occurred. The lack of reaction left Karen stunned. She had been so certain that her prank would elicit some kind of response, a glare, a scolding, maybe even a laugh. But this eerie composure was unnerving. It made her feel small and foolish, like a child throwing temper tantrums in front of an unshakable adult. For the first time since arriving in London, Karen found herself questioning whether she had gone too far. Her confidence began to waver as reality started sinking in. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, filled with disapproval and disbelief. Someone muttered, "That poor man," while another shook their head and said, "Americans, always causing trouble." Karen felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, but she tried to brush it off. Maybe they didn't understand. It was just a joke after all, right? As she stood frozen, gripping the pepper spray tightly in her hand, Karen noticed a subtle change in Corporal Harris' demeanor. Though his expression remained neutral, he gave a barely perceptible nod to another guard stationed a few feet away. The second guard quickly reached for his radio, speaking quietly into it before returning to his post. Whatever message he was relaying, it sent a chill down Karen's spine. Before she could process what was happening, a uniformed officer appeared, striding purposefully through the crowd. His presence commanded immediate attention, and the once lively atmosphere turned somber. Tourists parted to let him pass, their cameras now trained on Karen instead of the guards. As the officer approached, Karen's bravado crumbled completely. Her knees felt weak, and her palms grew clammy. "Ma'am," the officer said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you need to come with me." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. All she could think about was how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. What had started as a harmless prank designed to entertain, and perhaps annoy, had escalated into something far more serious. And as she followed the officer away from the scene, surrounded by judgmental stares and whispered criticisms, Karen couldn't shake the sinking feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. As Karen followed the officer away from the scene, her mind raced with a whirlwind of emotions: panic, regret, and disbelief. She clutched her purse tightly, the pepper spray still tucked inside, as if it were somehow evidence of her poor judgment. The crowd that had once been amused by her antics now watched her with cold, disapproving stares. Some people whispered loudly enough for her to hear, "Unbelievable," and "What was she thinking?" Each comment felt like a dagger, slicing through what little confidence she had left. The walk to the nearby security station seemed impossibly long, every step heavy with dread. Karen glanced over her shoulder, hoping to catch one last glimpse of Corporal Harris. He stood exactly where she'd left him, tall and stoic, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. His composure only deepened her shame. How could someone remain so calm after being sprayed in the face? It made her feel even smaller, more reckless, and utterly foolish. When they reached the station, the officer gestured for Karen to sit down on a hard plastic chair near a desk cluttered with papers and radios. He didn't offer her water or ask if she was okay. Instead, he began asking sharp, pointed questions. "Do you realize what you've done?" he asked, his voice firm but controlled. "You assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, a soldier sworn to protect this country. Karen's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to explain, but the words came out jumbled and weak. I thought it was funny," she stammered. "I didn't mean any harm. I thought he was just pretending." Even as she said it, she knew how ridiculous it sounded. Pretending. These men weren't actors. They were real soldiers, trained professionals carrying out their duties with discipline and honor. And here she was, treating them like props in her own personal show. The officer sighed heavily, clearly unimpressed by her excuses. "This isn't a game, Mom," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Those guards are protecting something far greater than themselves. They represent centuries of tradition and service to the crown. What you did today is not only disrespectful, it's illegal." Karen's stomach churned at the word illegal. She hadn't considered the legal consequences when she pulled out the pepper spray. Back home, pranks like this might earn eye rolls or scoldings, but nothing serious. Here, however, things were different. London wasn't Ohio. The rules weren't the same. As the weight of her actions settled over her, tears welled up in her eyes. For the first time in her life, Karen felt truly powerless. To make matters worse, the officer informed her that possession of pepper spray was also against the law in the UK unless specifically licensed. "We'll need to confiscate that," he said, nodding toward her purse. Reluctantly, Karen handed it over, feeling like a child caught misbehaving. The small canister looked harmless in her hand moments ago, but now it felt like a weapon, an ugly reminder of her impulsiveness. While waiting for further instructions, Karen tried calling her family back in the U.S. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number, and when her mother answered, Karen burst into tears. Between sobs, she managed to explain what had happened. "Mom, I messed up big time," she choked out. "I sprayed a guard at Buckingham Palace, and now the police are involved. I don't know what's going to happen." Her mother's response was a mix of shock and frustration. "Karen, what were you thinking?" she exclaimed. "You're in another country. You can't just act like you do at home. This isn't some silly prank. It's serious." The call ended abruptly, leaving Karen feeling even lonelier than before. She buried her face in her hands, replaying the events of the day in her mind. Why hadn't she stopped herself? Why hadn't she listened to the warnings about respecting the guards and following the rules? The answers eluded her, drowned out by waves of guilt and fear. Eventually, an older officer arrived to take over the case. He introduced himself as Inspector Collins and explained the charges she faced: assault on a member of the armed forces and possession of an offensive weapon. Both carried significant penalties, including potential jail time. Karen's heart sank. Jail? That couldn't be real. She was just a tourist, an ordinary woman who'd made a stupid mistake. Surely there had to be a way out of this nightmare. Inspector Collins must have noticed her distress because his tone softened slightly. "Look," he said, "you'll have a chance to explain yourself properly during questioning. Depending on your cooperation, we may be able to resolve this without escalating it further. But understand, Ms. Karen, actions have consequences, especially here." His words lingered in her mind as she nodded silently. Consequences. That was something Karen hadn't considered when she decided to spray Corporal Harris. Now, Karen sat in the small, sterile room at the police station, her mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow that made her feel even more exposed and vulnerable. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white from the tension. Outside, she could hear the faint hum of activity. Officers talking, phones ringing, footsteps echoing down the hallway. But inside the room, there was an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on her. Inspector Collins returned after what felt like hours, carrying a clipboard and a stern expression. He took a seat across from her, placing the clipboard on the table between them. "All right, Ms. Karen," he began, his tone professional but not unkind. "Let's go over what happened today. Start from the beginning." Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry. She knew this was her chance to explain herself, to make him understand that she hadn't intended to cause harm or disrespect anyone. But as she opened her mouth to speak, the words caught in her throat. How could she possibly justify spraying pepper spray at a royal guard? It sounded absurd even to her own ears. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. I thought they were just part of some kind of performance. Like, those actors who stand still and let people take pictures with them. I didn't realize they were actual soldiers doing their job. Inspector Collins raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You didn't think twice about reading the signs around the palace grounds, or noticing the rifles they carry. Ma'am, these men are highly trained members of the British Army. Their role is no joke. Karen nodded quickly, tears welling up in her eyes again. I see that now. I really do. I wasn't thinking straight. I got carried away trying to entertain my friends back home. I wanted to post something funny online, but I never meant to hurt anyone or break any laws. The inspector studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and leaned back in his chair. Miss Karen, we've contacted your embassy, and they're aware of the situation. You'll be allowed to return to the U.S., but only after we've completed our investigation. In the meantime, you'll need to stay in London until everything is resolved. Karen's heart sank. Stay in London. For how long? Days? Weeks? The thought of being stuck in a foreign country while facing criminal charges terrified her. What would happen to her job? Her reputation? Her life? As if sensing her panic, Inspector Collins added, depending on your cooperation and whether Corporal Harris decides to press charges, we may be able to keep this out of court. But understand, ma'am, this isn't something we can simply sweep under the rug. Assaulting a member of the armed forces is a serious offense. Karen nodded again, her chest tightening with anxiety. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, she said earnestly. I'll apologize to the guard, to everyone. I'll pay any fines, do community service, anything. I just want to make things right. Inspector Collins gave her a measured look before jotting down a few notes on his clipboard. Good. That's a start. We'll arrange for you to meet with Corporal Harris tomorrow, so you can issue your apology directly. Until then, you're free to leave, but don't leave the city. Do you understand? Yes, Karen whispered, relief washing over her despite the gravity of the situation. At least she had a chance to apologize, to try to undo some of the damage she'd caused. As she stood up to leave, her legs felt shaky, like jelly beneath her. She thanked the inspector quietly and walked out of the station, blinking in the bright daylight. Outside, the streets of London seemed eerily quiet compared to earlier that day. People passed by without giving her a second glance, unaware of the turmoil brewing inside her. Karen wandered aimlessly for a while, her thoughts consumed by guilt and regret. Every step reminded her of how reckless she had been, how selfish and entitled her actions had seemed. She replayed the scene over and over in her mind, the spray, the crowd's gasps, Corporal Harris's unwavering composure, and each memory stung worse than the last. Eventually, Karen found herself sitting on a park bench near Hyde Park, staring blankly at the fountain in front of her. A young family played nearby, laughing and enjoying the afternoon sun. Watching them, Karen felt a pang of longing, for simpler times, for forgiveness, for a way to turn back the clock. Instead, all she could do was wait for tomorrow, when she would face Corporal Harris again, and hope that her apology might begin to mend the mess she had created. The next morning, Karen woke up feeling like a stranger in her own skin. Her hotel room, which had once seemed cozy and welcoming, now felt suffocating. The sunlight streaming through the window did little to lift her spirits. Instead, it only highlighted the dark circles under her eyes from a sleepless night spent tossing and turning. Today was the day she would meet Corporal Harris again, this time not as an impulsive tourist, but as someone who needed to make amends. After getting dressed in the plainest outfit she could find, a simple beige sweater and jeans, Karen headed to St. James's Palace, where the meeting had been arranged. Her stomach churned with every step, and she clutched her purse tightly, as though it might ground her somehow. When she arrived, she spotted Inspector Collins waiting for her near the entrance. He nodded curtly as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" he asked, his tone neutral. Karen swallowed hard and nodded, though she wasn't sure she'd ever truly feel ready for this moment. The inspector led her through the gates and into the courtyard, where Corporal Harris stood alongside another officer. His posture was as rigid as ever, his face impassive. Seeing him again sent a fresh wave of shame coursing through Karen. Inspector Collins gestured for her to step forward. "This is your chance," he said quietly before stepping aside to give them space. Karen hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and walked toward Corporal Harris. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. "Corporal Harris," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time. "Corporal Harris, I want to apologize. What I did yesterday, it was wrong. I didn't understand the seriousness of my actions, and I deeply regret it." She paused, searching his face for any sign of emotion, but his expression remained stoic. Encouraged by the silence, she continued, "You were just doing your job, and I disrespected that. I embarrassed myself, I embarrassed my country, and most importantly, I disrespected you and everything you stand for. I'm so sorry." For what felt like an eternity, Corporal Harris didn't respond. He simply stared straight ahead, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond her. Finally, he blinked and turned his head slightly to look at her. His eyes were calm but piercing, as if they could see right through her. "Apology accepted," he said in a low, measured voice. Then, without another word, he returned to his original position, staring straight ahead once more. Karen stood there for a moment, stunned. That was it. Just 2 words. She had expected anger, frustration, maybe even a lecture about responsibility and respect. But instead, all she received was quiet acceptance. It left her feeling both relieved and oddly unsettled. Was it enough? Had she done enough to begin making things right? As Karen stepped back, Inspector Collins reappeared and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "That went better than expected," he said, his tone softer now. "He didn't have to accept your apology, but he did. Take that as a positive sign." Karen nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. This time, they weren't tears of fear or panic. They were tears of gratitude and humility. For the first time since arriving in London, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this experience could teach her something valuable. Maybe she could use it to grow, to become a better version of herself. Before leaving the palace grounds, Karen glanced back at Corporal Harris one last time. He hadn't moved an inch, standing tall and proud despite everything that had happened. Watching him, Karen realized how much strength it must have taken to remain so composed, not just during the incident itself, but afterward too. In that moment, she vowed to carry a piece of that strength with her, to remind herself of the importance of dignity and self-control. As she walked away, Karen knew her journey wasn't over. Apologizing to Corporal Harris was just the beginning. Back home, she would face judgment from friends, family, and possibly even strangers online. But for now, she allowed herself a small sense of relief. One step at a time, she told herself. One step at a time. When Karen returned to the United States, she was met with a storm of reactions that she hadn't fully anticipated. News of her pepper spray incident had spread like wildfire across social media platforms and even made its way onto local news outlets. Headlines like "Tourists' Prank Turns Sour at Buckingham Palace" and "American Causes Uproar by Assaulting Royal Guard" were everywhere. Memes mocking her actions flooded Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, turning her into an overnight internet sensation, but not the kind she'd ever wanted. Her friends and acquaintances back home were divided in their responses. Some tried to defend her, saying things like, "Karen didn't mean any harm, it was just a dumb mistake." Others distanced themselves entirely, deleting her from group chats or unfollowing her on social media. Even her coworkers treated her differently when she walked into the office after taking leave for the investigation. Whispers followed her down the hallways, and during lunch breaks, people avoided sitting near her. It was as though she'd become a pariah overnight. The backlash wasn't limited to her personal life. Her employer called her into a meeting shortly after her return. Sitting in the conference room, Karen braced herself for what was coming next. Her boss, usually warm and approachable, looked unusually serious as he slid a printed article across the table toward her. The headline read, "Company Employee Sparks International Incident." "We've received complaints from clients about your behavior," he said, folding his arms. "They're concerned about how this reflects on our brand. You understand we can't ignore something like this, right?" Karen nodded numbly, her stomach sinking. She had always prided herself on being well-liked at work, someone who brought energy and positivity to the team. Now her name was associated with embarrassment and controversy. After a long pause, her boss sighed and told her they were placing her on unpaid leave until further notice. "Take some time to figure things out," he suggested, though his tone implied there might not be a way back. Feeling cornered and humiliated, Karen retreated to her apartment, where she spent hours scrolling through comments online. Most were harsh and unforgiving, calling her entitled, disrespectful, and clueless. But amid the negativity, she noticed a few messages offering a different perspective. One commenter wrote, "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do afterward." Another added, "She apologized. Maybe give her a chance to learn from this." Those words stuck with Karen. For days, she wrestled with guilt and self-doubt, replaying every detail of the incident in her mind. But slowly, an idea began to form. If people saw her as reckless and ignorant, maybe she could prove them wrong. Maybe she could use this experience to educate others, and herself, about cultural sensitivity and responsible travel. With newfound determination, Karen decided to issue a public apology. She recorded a video sitting in front of a plain background, her expression sincere and vulnerable. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I know many of you have seen the stories about what happened in London. First, I want to say how deeply sorry I am for spraying Corporal Harris, for disrespecting the Royal Guards, and for embarrassing my country. I let impulsiveness get the better of me, and I'll regret that moment for the rest of my life." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "What I did was unacceptable, and I'm working hard to make sure it never happens again. To anyone watching this, please remember that traveling isn't just about having fun or getting likes on social media. It's about respecting other cultures, learning from them, and leaving a positive impact wherever you go." The video went live late one evening, and within hours, it had thousands of views. The comments were mixed. Some praised her honesty, while others dismissed her apology as insincere. But Karen didn't care. This wasn't about winning people over anymore. It was about taking responsibility and starting fresh. Over the following weeks, Karen threw herself into volunteer work with organizations focused on fostering cross-cultural understanding. She attended workshops, read books, and even started mentoring high school students planning international trips. Each step felt like a small redemption, a way to turn her mistake into something meaningful. Though the scars of the incident would linger for a long time, Karen knew she was on the right path, one paved with humility, growth, and second chances. Months passed, and Karen's life began to transform in ways she never expected. The sting of public humiliation had faded slightly, replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild her reputation. She threw herself into her volunteer work with organizations promoting cultural exchange programs, eager to make amends for her past behavior. At first, it was daunting, speaking to groups about responsible travel while knowing her own story loomed in the background. But over time, she found her voice. Her honesty resonated with people, especially young travelers who admired her willingness to admit fault and grow from her mistakes. One day, an opportunity arose that Karen couldn't have imagined just months earlier. She was invited back to London as part of a global initiative aimed at fostering understanding between nations. The program paired American volunteers with local hosts in the UK to collaborate on community projects. For Karen, this felt like both a challenge and a chance to prove herself, to show the world and herself that she had truly changed. When she stepped off the plane in Heathrow Airport, Karen was nervous but hopeful. This wasn't the same brash tourist who had arrived months ago, armed with pepper spray and a thirst for attention. This version of Karen carried humility in her heart and a notebook filled with tips for respectful travel. As she made her way through customs, she couldn't help but wonder how people would react when they learned who she was. Would they recognize her, judge her, or worse, ignore her completely? Her fears eased somewhat when she met her host family, the Thompsons, a warm and welcoming couple living near Kensington. They greeted her with open arms, seemingly unaware of her infamous past. Over dinner on her first night, Karen debated whether to bring up what had happened. In the end, she decided honesty was the best policy. "Before we go any further," she said hesitantly, "I need to tell you something. My name might ring a bell because, well, I got into some trouble here last year. With a royal guard." To her surprise, Mrs. Thompson chuckled lightly. "Oh, don't worry, dear. We've all heard about it. But everyone deserves a second chance, don't they?" Her husband nodded in agreement, patting Karen's hand reassuringly. Their kindness brought tears to her eyes. For the first time since returning to London, Karen felt like she belonged. During her stay, Karen visited several landmarks, including St. James's Palace. It wasn't planned. It just sort of happened one afternoon while she was exploring the area. As she approached the familiar gates, her stomach tightened. Memories of that fateful day came rushing back. The crowd, the guards, the pepper spray, the crushing weight of regret. She almost turned around, but then she saw him. Corporal Harris, standing tall and stoic in his red tunic and bearskin hat. For a moment, Karen froze, unsure of what to do. Should she approach him? Would he even remember her? Gathering her courage, she walked slowly toward him, stopping a few feet away. "Corporal Harris," she said softly, her voice trembling. He glanced down at her, recognition flickering briefly in his eyes. "I owe you the biggest apology of my life." Karen continued, fighting back tears. "What I did was wrong, disrespectful, and selfish. I hope you can see that I'm trying to be better, to make things right." Harris studied her for a long moment before nodding curtly. "Apology accepted," he replied, his tone calm but firm. Then, without another word, he resumed his post, staring straight ahead as though nothing unusual had occurred. Though brief, the interaction left Karen feeling lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. As she walked away, Karen realized this moment wasn't just about closure. It was proof that change was possible. She had started this journey ashamed and broken, but now she stood stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to leave a positive mark on the world. And for the first time in a long time, she believed she could. Karen's time in London as part of the cultural exchange program became a turning point in her life. Each day, she worked alongside locals on community projects, from cleaning up parks to organizing workshops for students about global citizenship. At first, she worried that people might treat her differently once they learned about her infamous past, but to her surprise, most were understanding. They saw her efforts, not just her mistake, and welcomed her contributions. One afternoon, while helping paint a mural at a local community center, Karen struck up a conversation with a young woman named Sophie. Sophie was warm and curious, asking Karen what had inspired her to volunteer abroad. Karen hesitated for a moment, then decided to share her story. How a reckless decision had taught her the importance of respect and responsibility. To her relief, Sophie didn't judge her. Instead, she smiled and said, "You're living proof that people can change." "That's pretty amazing." Those words stayed with Karen long after their conversation ended. For so long, she had viewed her actions as a stain she could never wash away. But now, surrounded by people who believed in second chances, she began to see herself differently. Her past didn't define her. Her choices moving forward would. By the end of her stay, Karen had earned the trust and admiration of those around her. On her final day in London, the Thompsons threw a small farewell dinner in her honor. As they sat around the table sharing stories and laughter, Mrs. Thompson raised her glass. "To Karen," she said warmly, "for showing us all that growth is possible, no matter where you start." Tears welled up in Karen's eyes as she looked around the room and at the faces of people who had accepted her despite everything. She realized how far she'd come. From the brash tourist desperate for attention to someone who genuinely cared about making a difference. It wasn't an easy journey, but every step had been worth it. Back home in Ohio, Karen continued her mission to educate others. She started giving talks at schools and community centers, sharing her experience as a cautionary tale about cultural sensitivity and personal accountability. Her presentations were raw and honest, filled with humor and humility, which resonated deeply with audiences. People began reaching out to thank her, not because they agreed with what she'd done, but because her story reminded them that everyone makes mistakes and has the power to learn from them. Over time, Karen's reputation shifted. Once known as Pepper Spray Karen, she became recognized as an advocate for responsible travel and cross-cultural understanding. Her Instagram feed transformed too, featuring photos of meaningful moments, volunteering abroad, speaking at events, and connecting with people from different walks of life. The comment section was no longer filled with ridicule, but encouragement and gratitude. Looking back on her journey, Karen knew she would always carry the memory of that fateful day in London. But instead of letting it haunt her, she used it as motivation to keep growing. She often thought about Corporal Harris, whose quiet dignity had left such a lasting impression on her. Though they never spoke again after their brief encounter, his acceptance of her apology had given her the closure she needed to move forward. One evening, as Karen sat on her porch watching the sunset, she reflected on how much her life had changed. She wasn't the same person who had boarded that plane to London months ago. She was stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. A work in progress, but proud of how far she'd come. Mistakes had shaped her, yes, but so had the lessons she'd learned along the way. As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Karen smiled to herself. Life wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful in its imperfections. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace, with herself, with others, and with the world.